At 18 minutes past 6 on the evening of June 26, 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson pulled the canopy release on his P-47C Thunderbolt at Royal Air Force Station Manston in southeastern England. The canopy would not move. It was jammed. Hydraulic fluid covered the metal rails. Cannon shell fragments had bent the frame. Johnson could not get out of his aircraft. And that aircraft was dying. The engine was running rough, missing on at least 2 cylinders. The hydraulic system was empty. Fluid sprayed across the entire fuselage. The canopy was shattered, holes punched through the plexiglass by 20mm cannon shells. The instrument panel was destroyed. The oxygen system was gone. Johnson's face was burned. His hands were burned. His legs had shrapnel embedded in them. And somewhere behind his headrest was an unexploded 20mm shell that had jammed his canopy shut when it detonated against the armor plate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Johnson had just survived an attack that should have killed him. His P-47 Thunderbolt, serial number 4-1-6235, nicknamed Half Pint, had been hit by 21 20mm cannon shells and more than 200 machine gun bullets. The aircraft had caught fire in midair. It had spun out of control from 12,000 feet. It had been attacked repeatedly by a German Focke Wulf 190 Ace who emptied his guns trying to finish Johnson off. And somehow, the P-47 was still flying. Ground crew members surrounded the aircraft. They had watched it approach the field trailing smoke, hydraulic fluid streaming from holes in the fuselage, the propeller windmilling unevenly. The landing gear extended only because Johnson had released the emergency compressed air bottle when the hydraulic system failed. They had expected the aircraft to crash on landing. Instead, it rolled to a stop on the runway. But Johnson could not get out. The canopy was jammed. His hands were too weak to force it open. His vision was blurred from hydraulic fluid that had sprayed into his eyes during the attack. He could barely see the men running toward his aircraft. A crew chief climbed onto the wing. He grabbed the canopy frame and pulled. It would not move. Another mechanic joined him. Together they wrenched the canopy back, metal scraping against bent rails, until there was enough space for Johnson to climb out. He stood on the wing for a moment, then his legs gave out. The crew chief caught him before he fell. They lowered him to the ground. A medical officer was already running across the tarmac. Johnson tried to speak but could not form words. His throat was raw from breathing the smoke and fumes inside the burning cockpit. His face was swollen from the flash fire that had erupted when hydraulic fluid and oxygen mixed in the confined space. He was covered in blood, some his own, some possibly from the aircraft's severed hydraulic lines. The medical officer examined him quickly. Burns to the face, hands and legs. Shrapnel wounds. A bullet graze across the tip of his nose that had destroyed his oxygen mask. Minor injuries. Considering what the aircraft looked like, Johnson was conscious, breathing, able to move. He would survive. The medical officer helped him into an ambulance, and they drove to the base hospital. Behind them, mechanics and armourers surrounded Half Pint. They stared at the damage. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then one of the armourers started counting holes. He counted 20 on the fuselage, 30 on the right wing, 40 on the left wing, 50 near the tail. He stopped counting at 200. He had not walked all the way around the aircraft. Later, after the aircraft was towed to a hangar and inspected under lights, mechanics would document the full extent of the side damage. 21 impacts from 20mm high-explosive cannon shells. More than 200 hits from 7.92mm machine gun bullets. The engine had taken multiple hits. 2 cylinders were destroyed. The crankcase was cracked. Oil lines were severed. The cooling system was punctured. The turbo supercharger had a 20mm hole through the housing. The hydraulic system was completely destroyed. Every line had been cut. The reservoir was empty. Fluid had sprayed throughout the fuselage and cockpit. The canopy frame was bent. The plexiglass was shattered in multiple places. The instrument panel was wrecked. Gauges were destroyed. Wiring was severed. The radio was inoperative. The oxygen system was gone. The bottles had been punctured. The regulator was destroyed. The delivery lines were cut. The control surfaces had been hit repeatedly. The ailerons had holes in them. The elevators were damaged. The rudder had been struck by at least 3 cannon shells. The fuselage skin was punctured in dozens of places. Some holes were small, 7.92mm diameter, clean entry wounds from machine gun bullets. Other holes were larger, irregular, torn metal from 20mm high explosive shells that had detonated on impact. The right wing had sustained severe damage near the root. A 20mm shell had exploded just aft of the main spar, tearing a hole large enough to fit a man's fist through the upper and lower wing skins. Another shell had hit the flap mechanism, destroying the actuator and bending the flap itself. The left wing was similarly damaged. Multiple cannon hits along the leading edge, machine gun bullets through the aileron, a large hole in the wingtip where a 20mm shell had blown out a section of structure. Behind the cockpit, mechanics found the shell that had jammed Johnson's canopy. It was a 20mm high explosive round. It had struck the armor plate directly behind the pilot's headrest and detonated. The armor plate, a 1/4-inch thick hardened steel, had absorbed most of the blast, but fragments had been blown forward, bending the canopy rails and jamming the mechanism. If that shell had hit 6 inches lower, it would have gone through the back of Johnson's seat. He would have been killed instantly. The aircraft was declared Category E, total loss, not repairable. The airframe had absorbed too much structural damage. Even if the engine could be replaced, even if all the systems could be rebuilt, the wing spars were compromised. The fuselage structure was weakened. The aircraft would never be safe to fly again, but it had brought Johnson home. Robert Samuel Johnson was 23 years old. He had been born in Lawton, Oklahoma, on February 21, 1920. His father worked as an automobile mechanic. His mother was a school teacher. Johnson had grown up around machines, learning how engines worked, how mechanical systems functioned, how to fix things that broke. As a teenager, he had become obsessed with aviation. He spent his money on flying lessons at a small airfield near Lawton. By the time he was 18, he had his private pilot's license and enough flight hours to feel confident in an aircraft. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Johnson was already training at an Army Air Force's pilot school. He graduated on July 9, 1942, commissioned as a second lieutenant. 10 days later, he was assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, a newly formed unit equipped with the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was the largest single-engine fighter aircraft ever built. It weighed 10,000 pounds empty. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, pilot, and equipment, it could reach 17,500 pounds. That was more than twice the weight of a Supermarine Spitfire. It was nearly 3,000 pounds heavier than a North American P-51 Mustang. The aircraft was massive. Pilots who saw it for the first time were stunned by its size. It looked more like a bomber than a fighter. The P-47's size came from its engine. The Pratt & Whitney R 2800 Double Wasp was an 18-cylinder, 2-row radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. To get that power to high altitude, the engine was equipped with a General Electric turbo-supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage. Exhaust gases from the engine drove the turbine. The turbine compressed intake air and forced it back into the engine at high pressure. At sea level, the system added little, but at 25,000 feet, where the air was thin, the turbo-supercharger maintained engine power that would otherwise drop to a fraction of its rated output. The turbo system required ducting. Large diameter pipes ran from the engine back to the turbo-supercharger in the tail, then forward again to the engine. Those ducts took up space. They added weight. They made the fuselage large and round. That is why pilots called the P-47 the Jug. It looked like a milk jug, round, bulky, inelegant. But that size had advantages. The fuselage was spacious enough to accommodate heavy armor protection. A thick steel plate behind the pilot's seat, another plate behind the engine, armored glass in the windscreen. The cockpit itself was built like a tank. armor on the sides, armor on the floor, armor surrounding the pilot on 3 sides. The radial engine provided additional protection. Unlike inline liquid-cooled engines like the Rolls-Royce Merlin or the Daimler-Benz 605, which had vulnerable coolant systems that would fail if punctured, the R2800 was air-cooled. Each cylinder was independent. If one cylinder was destroyed by enemy fire, the other 17 kept running. If 2 cylinders were lost, 16 remained. Pilots reported bringing P-47 seconds home with multiple cylinders completely shot away, the engine still producing enough power to fly. The fuel system was similarly robust. The main fuel tank was located behind the engine, protected by the firewall and surrounded by structure. The auxiliary tanks were in the wings, inside the main spars, protected by the wings' structural strength. All fuel lines were armored or routed through protected areas. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard. If a bullet or shell fragment punctured a tank, the rubber lining would swell and seal the hole within seconds. The control systems used steel cables routed through the fuselage in armored conduits. If one cable was cut, backup cables would continue to provide control. The hydraulic system, which operated the landing gear, flaps, and brakes, had backup emergency systems. If hydraulics failed, the pilot could release compressed air bottles to extend the gear and flaps mechanically. Even the turbo supercharger system, which seemed vulnerable due to the long ducting runs, was surprisingly resilient. The ducts were made of heavy-gauge steel. Small holes would not significantly affect performance. Even large holes could be tolerated as long as the turbine itself was not destroyed. Johnson had trained in the P-47 throughout late 1942. The 56th Fighter Group had been formed at Savannah Army Air Base in Georgia in June 1942. The unit received the first production P-47B models in September and began intensive training. The P-47 was a challenging aircraft to master. It was heavy, it was fast, it had tremendous power. But it did not turn well at low speed. It did not climb as quickly as lighter fighters, and it had a tendency to enter compressibility dives if pushed too fast at high altitude, a phenomenon that pilots were only beginning to understand. The 56th Fighter Group lost more than 18 pilots in training accidents during late 1942. Aircraft crashed on takeoff when pilots failed to manage the immense torque from the R2800 engine. Aircraft crashed on landing when pilots misjudged the P-47's weight and speed. Aircraft were lost in compressibility dives when pilots exceeded the aircraft's critical Mach number and the controls became ineffective. Johnson survived the training. He learned to handle the P-47's power. He learned to manage its weight. He learned when to push the aircraft and when to hold back. In January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group sailed for England aboard the RMS Queen Elizabeth. They arrived in Scotland on January 13th and moved to Royal Air Force Station King's Cliff in Northamptonshire. The unit's mission was to provide fighter escort for American heavy bombers attacking targets in occupied Europe. American bombing operations over Europe in early 1943 were suffering terrible losses. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were being shot down by German fighters at unsustainable rates. Missions deep into Germany were resulting in losses of 8 to 10%. More than 20% of the attacking force. The bombers needed escort fighters that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. But in early 1943, no American fighter had that capability. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had good range, but was complex, expensive, and difficult to maintain. The P-47 Thunderbolt had limited range with internal fuel only. It could reach targets in France and Belgium, but not deep into Germany. And it was untested in combat against the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots. Johnson flew his first combat mission on April 13, 1943. It was an escort mission for B-17 bombers attacking a target in the Netherlands. The 56th Fighter Group flew high cover, staying above the bomber formation, watching for German interceptors. No enemy aircraft appeared. Johnson returned to base without seeing combat. His second mission, 3 days later, was different. German Focke Wulf 190 fighters attacked the bomber formation. Johnson saw them diving from above, firing at the B-17 seconds, then pulling up and climbing away before the P-47 seconds could react. Johnson tried to pursue, but the Focke Wulfs were faster in a dive and could outclimb the P-47 seconds at low altitude. He fired at one enemy aircraft but saw no hits. The German fighter escaped. Over the next 2 months, Johnson flew escort missions almost every day the weather permitted. He learned how the Luftwaffe operated. German fighters would wait until the bombers were deep inside occupied territory, beyond the range of most escort fighters, then attack in coordinated groups. They used altitude advantage. They attacked from above and behind, diving through the bomber formations at high speed, firing short bursts, then pulling up and away before the escorts could engage. If escort fighters pursued, the German pilots would either dive away, using their superior speed, or climb away, using their better climb rate at medium altitude. The P-47 had advantages, but they were not obvious. At high altitude, above 25,000 feet, the P-47's turbo supercharger gave it power that German fighters could not match. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke Wulf 190 both used mechanically driven superchargers that lost effectiveness above 25,000 feet. The P-47 maintained full power to 30,000 feet and beyond. At high altitude, the P-47 was as fast as any German fighter. It could outrun anything in level flight. It could outdive everything due to its weight and strength. The P-47 could also absorb damage that would destroy other fighters. Johnson saw this in May 1943, when a squadron mate took a 20mm cannon, hit through the engine. The shell destroyed one cylinder and damaged 2 others. The pilot flew back to England on the remaining 15 cylinders and landed safely. Another pilot had his hydraulic system shot out. He extended the landing gear using the emergency compressed air system and landed without flaps or brakes. The aircraft rolled off the end of the runway into a field, but the pilot walked away uninjured. By mid-June 1943, Johnson had flown more than 20 combat missions. He had not shot down any enemy aircraft. He had fired at several, but confirmed kills were rare. The Luftwaffe pilots were experienced. They knew when to attack and when to disengage. They did not stay and fight if the tactical situation was unfavorable. Johnson was still learning. He was following orders, staying in formation, protecting the bombers. But he was aggressive. He wanted to engage the enemy. He wanted kills. His commanders noticed this. They warned him about breaking formation. They told him that protecting the bombers was more important than chasing individual enemy fighters. Johnson understood, but he did not always agree. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was assigned to fly as part of the 61st Fighter Squadron's formation. The mission was to provide withdrawal support for B-17 bombers, returning from an attack on Villacoublay airfield near Paris. 48 P-47C Thunderbolts took off from Royal Air Force Station Manston late in the afternoon. Manston was a forward operating base on the southeastern tip of England, close to the French coast. Using Manston allowed the P-47 seconds to extend their range slightly, reaching farther into occupied France before their fuel state required them to turn back. The weather was clear. Visibility was good. The P-47 seconds climbed to altitude and headed south across the English Channel. Johnson was flying tail end Charlie, the last aircraft in his squadron's formation, the most vulnerable position. Aircraft in the rear were always the first to be attacked. German fighters would approach from behind and above, targeting the rearmost aircraft before the formation could react. Johnson knew this. Every pilot knew this. But someone had to fly tail end Charlie. At approximately 1800 hours, as the P-47 seconds approached the rendezvous point near Forges-les-Eaux in northern France, Johnson saw aircraft diving from above. He tried to call a warning on the radio. His microphone button was not working properly. Nobody heard his transmission. 16. Focke Wulf, 1, 90 fighters from Jagdgeschwader, 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, hit the P-47 formation from above and behind. The first pass scattered the American fighters. Pilots broke in all directions, trying to avoid the initial attack, trying to gain maneuvering room, trying to position themselves for counterattacks. Johnson's P-47 was hit in the first pass. He felt the impacts. Heavy thuds as 20mm cannon shells struck the fuselage. The canopy shattered. Fragments of plexiglass flew through the cockpit. The instrument panel exploded. Hydraulic fluid sprayed everywhere, covering Johnson's face, his goggles, his gloves. The aircraft shuddered. The engine sputtered. The nose dropped. Johnson tried to pull back on the stick, but the aircraft would not respond. It was falling, spinning, dropping out of control. The P-47 fell from 12,000 feet. It spun to the right, the nose dropping steeply, the airspeed increasing rapidly. Johnson kicked the left rudder, trying to stop the spin. The aircraft responded slightly. He kicked harder. The spin slowed. He pulled back on the stick. The nose came up, but sluggishly. The aircraft was still falling. At 6,000 feet, Johnson regained partial control. The P-47 was no longer spinning, but it was in a steep dive. He pulled harder on the stick. The nose came up further. The dive angle decreased. At 4,000 feet, the aircraft leveled off. Johnson looked at his instruments. Most were destroyed. The airspeed indicator was shattered. The altimeter was barely readable. The engine instruments showed oil pressure fluctuating wildly, temperature climbing into the red zone. He tried to assess the damage. The canopy was destroyed. Wind was howling through the cockpit. The hydraulic fluid that had sprayed everywhere was now being blown around by the airflow, making it difficult to see. His goggles were covered in fluid. He pulled them off. His vision blurred. The fluid was in his eyes. It burned. He tried to wipe it away with his glove, but that only spread it around. He could barely see. The engine was running rough. He could hear it missing, cylinders not firing, the rhythm uneven. The aircraft was vibrating. He looked at the oil pressure gauge. The needle was bouncing between 0 and normal. The cooling system must be damaged. Without oil pressure, the engine would seize within minutes. Johnson pointed the nose toward England. The English Channel was 60 miles north. If he could keep the engine running for 10 more minutes, he might make it across the water. If the engine quit over land, he would be captured. If it quit over the channel, he might be rescued by air-sea rescue. He was, flying at 2,000 feet, trying to maintain altitude, trying to keep the engine from overheating. Then he saw it. A Focke Wulf, 190, blue and yellow camouflage, coming up behind him. The German pilot had seen Johnson's damaged P-47 falling out of the formation. He had followed him down. Now he was positioning for the kill. Johnson had no way to defend himself. His guns might still work, but he could barely see. He could not maneuver aggressively without losing control. The engine would not tolerate combat power. He was helpless. The Focke Wulf opened fire. Johnson heard the cannon shells hitting his aircraft. More impacts on the fuselage, more hits on the wings. The P-47 shook with each strike, but it kept flying. The German pilot closed to point-blank range. He fired again. Cannon shells and machine gun bullets ripped into the Thunderbolt's tail. The rudder was hit. The elevators were struck. Still, the P-47 flew. Johnson could not understand it. He had been hit dozens of times. The aircraft should be falling apart. The engine should have quit. The controls should have failed. But the Thunderbolt was still responding. Sluggish, damaged, barely controllable, but still flying. The Focke Wulf made another pass. Johnson heard the guns firing. He felt more impacts, then silence. The German pilot had run out of ammunition. He had fired everything. All of his 20mm cannon shells, all of his machine gun ammunition. And Johnson's P-47 was still in the air. The Focke Wulf pulled alongside Johnson's damaged Thunderbolt. The German pilot looked across at Johnson. Their eyes met for a moment. The German pilot raised his hand in salute. Then he rolled away and headed back toward France. Johnson was alone. He looked ahead. The French coast was 10 miles away. Beyond that, the English Channel. 60 miles of water. If the engine quit now, he would have to ditch in the channel. He would have a chance with air-sea rescue if they could find him quickly. If not, he would die of exposure within hours. The P-47 crossed the French coast. Johnson was now over the channel. He looked at the engine gauges. Oil pressure was dropping. Temperature was climbing. The engine was dying. He eased back on the throttle slightly, reducing power, trying to extend the engine's life. The airspeed dropped. The nose wanted to sink. He pulled back on the stick to maintain altitude. The aircraft was barely flying. 5 miles offshore, 10 miles, 15 miles. The engine kept running. 20 miles. Johnson could see the English coast ahead. White cliffs, green fields. He was going to make it. 30 miles from the English coast, Johnson's radio came back to life. He had not realized it was damaged, but apparently some circuit had been broken and had now reconnected. He heard an English voice. "Hello, hello, climb if you can. You're getting very faint." It was an air-sea rescue. They had been monitoring the area. They had heard something. Perhaps Johnson's earlier attempts to call for help, perhaps just static from his damaged radio. Johnson pressed his microphone button. "I'll try, but I'm down to less than 1,000 feet. The voice came back immediately. "Roger, we have you. Keep coming." "You're almost home." Johnson felt a surge of relief. Someone knew where he was. If he had to ditch now, they would know where to look. He eased back on the stick. The P-47's nose came up slightly. The aircraft began to climb. Slowly, 50 feet per minute. Then 100. Johnson could not believe it. The engine was still running. The aircraft was still climbing. At 5,000 feet, he levelled off. The English coast was now clearly visible. He recognized the landmarks. He was approaching Manston. He called the tower. "Manston Tower, this is Keyworth Blue 4. I'm badly shot up. Hydraulics are gone. I'll need the emergency gear extension. I have no flaps, no brakes. Stand by for a crash landing." The tower responded immediately. "Roger, Blue 4. Fire trucks and ambulance are standing by. You're cleared to land on any runway." Johnson circled the field once, losing altitude. At 1,000 feet, he reached up and pulled the emergency gear extension handle. He heard compressed air hissing through lines. The landing gear began to extend. The main wheels came down. The tail wheel dropped into position. Green lights appeared on the panel, indicating the gear was locked. At least that system had worked. Johnson lined up with the runway. No flaps meant he would be coming in fast. No brakes meant he would have a long rollout. He needed to land as slow as possible without stalling. He pulled the throttle back. The engine sound changed. The propeller windmilled. The P-47 descended. At 50 feet, Johnson pulled back slightly. The aircraft settled. At 20 feet, he pulled back more. The main wheels touched. The P-47 bounced once, then settled again. It rolled down the runway, slow but steady. Without brakes, the rollout was long. The P-47 used nearly the entire runway before rolling to a stop. Johnson sat in the cockpit for a moment. He was alive. He had made it back. Then he tried to open the canopy. It would not move. The investigation into what had happened to Johnson's P-47 began the next morning. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, walked through the hangar where Half Pint had been towed. He stood in front of the aircraft for several minutes without speaking. Zemke had been flying fighters since 1936. He had seen combat-damaged aircraft before. He had seen P-47 seconds return with engine damage, with control surface damage, with fuselage holes. But he had never seen anything like this. The aircraft looked like it had been used for target practice. Holes everywhere, large holes from cannon shells, small holes from machine gun bullets, torn metal, bent structures, shattered systems, and yet it had flown more than 60 miles and landed successfully. Zemke called for the engineering officer. Captain Francis Gabreski, who would later become one of the top American aces with 28 confirmed kills, was also present. They wanted to understand how this aircraft had survived. The engineering officer began his assessment methodically. He started with the engine. The R-2800 had taken multiple hits. 2 cylinders on the left side were completely destroyed. The cylinder heads were gone. The pistons were damaged. The connecting rods were bent. Another cylinder on the right side had a bullet hole through the cooling fins. The crankcase had a crack approximately 6 inches long where a cannon shell fragment had struck. Oil had been leaking from that crack throughout Johnson's flight home. The oil tank had been punctured. The oil cooler had 3 bullet holes through the core. The turbo supercharger housing had a 20mm hole completely through it. One of the exhaust ducts leading to the turbine had been severed partially. Hot exhaust gases had been venting into the fuselage during flight. Despite all of this damage, the engine had continued running. The engineering officer explained why. The R-2800 had 18 cylinders. Losing 2 cylinders meant the engine was operating at 89% of its cylinder count. That was enough to maintain flight. The crankcase crack had allowed oil to leak, but slowly. The P-47 carried 26 gallons of oil. Even with the leak, enough oil remained in the system to provide lubrication for the 60-mile flight. The turbo supercharger damage had reduced boost pressure, which reduced power at altitude. But at low altitude, where Johnson had been flying, the turbo contributed less to engine performance. The engine's mechanical supercharger had been undamaged and provided sufficient compression for low-level flight. The hydraulic system damage was total. Every hydraulic line in the aircraft had been cut by bullets or shell fragments. The reservoir had been emptied. Fluid had sprayed throughout the fuselage and cockpit. That explained why Johnson's visibility had been so poor. Hydraulic fluid is a petroleum-based liquid that does not ignite easily, but it creates a fine mist when sprayed under pressure. That mist had filled the cockpit, coating Johnson's goggles, his face, the instruments. The engineering officer noted that if the P-47 had used a different hydraulic fluid, one that was more flammable, the aircraft would have caught fire and burned. Republic Aviation had chosen a fire-resistant hydraulic fluid specifically to prevent that scenario. The flight control system had been damaged but remained functional. The cables that connected the control stick to the elevators and ailerons ran through the fuselage in armored conduits. Several cables had been hit, but the P-47 used multiple redundant cables for each control surface. The elevator had 4 separate cables. 2 had been severed, 2 remained intact. That was enough for Johnson to maintain pitch, control. The aileron cables had suffered similar damage. 3 of 6 cables were cut. 3 remained. The rudder cables had all survived. That was fortunate because the rudder cables ran along the sides of the fuselage where they were somewhat protected by structure. If those cables had been cut, Johnson would have had no directional control. The aircraft would have been unflyable. The fuel system had been hit multiple times, but had not failed catastrophically. The self-sealing fuel tanks had worked as designed. Bullets and shell fragments had punctured the tanks in at least 7 locations. The rubber lining had swelled around each puncture and sealed it within seconds. Some fuel had been lost, but most remained in the tanks. The fuel lines, which were armoured, had survived intact. One interesting discovery was that a 20mm cannon shell had passed completely through the left wing without detonating. The shell had entered the lower wing skin near the landing light, passed through the wing structure, and exited through the upper skin. The hole was large, approximately 2 inches in diameter, but the wing structure had not failed. The main spar had not been hit. The shell had passed between the spar and the leading edge, missing critical structure by inches. The canopy damage was severe. 11 separate holes had been punched through the plexiglass by machine gun bullets and cannon shell fragments. The frame had been bent by the explosion of the 20mm shell that had hit the armor plate behind Johnson's headrest. That shell had detonated on impact with the armor. The armor had absorbed most of the blast energy. Fragments had been blown forward and sideways. Some fragments had struck the canopy frame. Others had penetrated the upper fuselage skin. One large fragment had bent the canopy rail, jamming the mechanism. If that shell had been a solid armor-piercing round instead of a high-explosive round, it might have penetrated the quarter-inch armor plate. If it had hit 6 inches lower, below the armor plate, it would have gone through the back of Johnson's seat and killed him instantly. The armor had saved his life. Colonel Zemke asked the engineering officer for his assessment. Could the aircraft be repaired? The engineering officer shook his head. The structural damage was too extensive. The wing spars had stress cracks from the cannon shell impacts. The fuselage frames were bent. The engine would need to be completely replaced. The hydraulic system would need to be entirely rebuilt. The electrical system would need to be rewired. The instrument panel would need to be replaced. The cost in time, labor, and materials would exceed the cost of building a new aircraft. Half Pint was a total loss. But it had done its job. It had brought its pilot home alive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The story of Johnson's survival spread quickly through the 56th Fighter Group. Pilots who had been skeptical about the P-47's toughness began to revise their opinions. The aircraft might be heavy. It might not turn out well. It might not climb as fast as lighter fighters. But it could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft and keep flying. That psychological shift was significant. Fighter pilots, who believe their aircraft is fragile, will fight defensively. They will avoid risks. They will disengage at the first sign of damage. But pilots who trust their aircraft's durability will fight aggressively. They will press attacks. They will accept damage if it means destroying the enemy. The P-47 earned that trust through incidents like Johnson's survival. Within weeks, other P-47 pilots began returning with similar stories. A pilot from the 356th Fighter Group landed with more than 50 bullet holes in his aircraft. The engine was still running. Another pilot, from the 4th Fighter Group, was hit by a flak that destroyed his rudder. He flew home using differential throttle and aileron trim to maintain directional control. A pilot from the 352nd Fighter Group had his canopy blown off by a cannon shell. He flew home at low altitude where the air was thicker and warmer, preventing hypothermia. The P-47's reputation for toughness grew with each incident. German pilots began to notice something unusual about American P-47 formations. The Thunderbolts were not breaking off engagements as quickly as other American fighters. P-38 pilots would disengage if damaged. P-51 pilots would run for home if their cooling systems were hit. But P-47 pilots would continue fighting even after taking significant damage. Luftwaffe intelligence officers collected reports from German pilots who had engaged P-47 seconds. One Focke Wulf 190 pilot reported hitting a Thunderbolt with multiple cannon shells and watching it continue to fly. Another pilot reported shooting a P-47's engine until smoke poured from the cowling, yet the American aircraft accelerated away and escaped. A third pilot reported emptying his guns into a P-47 that was flying straight and level, seemingly an easy target. The P-47 had absorbed the entire attack and then turned to engage him. The German pilot had been forced to disengage due to lack of ammunition. These reports created uncertainty among Luftwaffe fighter pilots. How many hits did it take to destroy a P-47? How much ammunition should be expended on a single target? If a P-47 was smoking and appeared damaged, was it actually crippled or was it still dangerous? The uncertainty affected German tactics. Some pilots began to avoid P-47 seconds unless they had a clear advantage. Others would make one pass and then disengage rather than pursuing a damaged Thunderbolt to confirm the kill. That hesitation gave P-47 pilots additional opportunities to escape or counterattack. The incident involving Robert Johnson and the Focke Wulf 190 pilot who saluted him became particularly well known. Johnson later learned that the German pilot was likely Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, commander of the 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader 26. Meyer was one of the Luftwaffe's most successful pilots. Official German records credited him with 102 aerial victories. He had been fighting since 1940 and had developed many of the tactics the Luftwaffe used against American bomber formations. Meyer's specialty was head-on attacks against B-17 seconds. He would lead his fighters straight into the bomber formations, firing at the vulnerable nose sections where the pilots sat. It was dangerous. It required nerve. But it was effective. Meyer had personally shot down dozens of B-17 seconds using this technique. On June 26, 1943, Meyer had been leading his group against the American bombers when they encountered the P-47 escort. His unit had engaged the Thunderbolts. Mayer had probably been the pilot who made the first pass on Johnson's aircraft, damaging it severely. He had then followed Johnson down, watching the P-47 fall out of control, assuming it would crash. When Johnson recovered control and began flying toward England, Mayer had pursued. He made multiple attacks. He fired all of his ammunition, more than 120 rounds of 20mm cannon shells, more than 1,000 rounds of 7.92mm machine gun bullets, and Johnson's P-47 had absorbed it all. Mayer had been flying Focke Wulf 190s since 1942. He knew what his guns could do. A single 20mm high-explosive shell could destroy a Spitfire's wing. A 2-second burst into a P-38's engine nacelle would set it on fire. A 3-second burst into a B-17's cockpit would kill the crew. But Johnson's P-47 had taken sustained fire from multiple passes and continued flying. Mayer had no explanation for this. When he pulled alongside Johnson's damaged Thunderbolt and saw the young American pilot still fighting to control his aircraft, Mayer's reaction was respect. This was an enemy who had survived everything Mayer could throw at him. That deserved acknowledgement. The salute was not a gesture of friendship. It was a warrior's recognition of another warrior who had earned survival through the toughness of his aircraft and his own determination. Mayer flew back to his airfield at Vitry-en-Artois in northern France. He reported engaging and damaging a P-47, but could not claim it as destroyed because he had not seen it crash. His wingmen confirmed the combat. The engagement was logged in Jagdgeschwader 26's records. Mayer would continue fighting until March 2, 1944, when he was killed during an attack on American bombers near Montmédy, France. His aircraft was hit by return fire from a B-17's gunners. Mayer was 27 years old at the time of his death. He never knew that the P-47 pilot he had saluted on June 26 survived the war and would later write about their encounter. Johnson spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The burns on his face and hands were painful but not serious. The shrapnel wounds in his legs were superficial. The worst injury was to his nose, where a bullet had grazed the tip, destroying his oxygen mask and nearly taking off the end of his nose. The bullet had struck at an angle, cutting through the rubber oxygen mask, grazing the skin, and exiting without causing major damage. A fraction of an inch difference, and the bullet would have entered Johnson's face or brain. He was released from the hospital on June 29th and returned to flight status. His first mission after the incident was on July 3rd, 4 days after leaving the hospital. He flew escort for B-17 bombers, attacking targets in occupied France. No enemy aircraft engaged his formation. He returned to base without incident. Over the next 7 months, Johnson flew mission after mission. He learned how to use the P-47's strengths: stay fast, stay high, use altitude advantage, use speed to dictate engagement terms, never get slow, never get into a turning fight at low altitude where German fighters had the advantage. By January 1944, Johnson had become an ace. He had shot down his 5th, 6th, and 7th enemy aircraft in a single mission on January 5th. By March, he had 10 confirmed kills. By May, he had 15. By June, he had 20. He was now one of the leading American fighter pilots in the European theatre. Johnson's tactics were aggressive but calculated. He used the P-47's ability to absorb damage as a tactical advantage. He knew he could press attacks closer than other pilots because his aircraft could survive hits that would destroy a Spitfire or a Mustang. He also understood that German pilots were becoming increasingly cautious about engaging P-47 seconds. They had learned, through incidents, like Johnson's survival, that Thunderbolts were hard to kill. That psychological advantage allowed Johnson to bluff sometimes. If a German fighter was chasing a friendly aircraft, Johnson would attack aggressively, knowing the German pilot might disengage rather than risk a prolonged engagement with a P-47. On June 13, 1944, exactly 1 year and 13 days after his nearly fatal mission, Johnson was leading a flight of P-47 seconds, escorting bombers deep into Germany. Near Minden, his formation encountered a large group of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. Johnson engaged immediately. He shot down 3 enemy aircraft in less than 10 minutes. One was hit during a diving attack. The Bf-109 exploded when Johnson's .50 caliber bullets ignited its fuel tank. The second was destroyed during a head-on pass. Johnson fired a burst. The German pilot broke left. Johnson followed and fired again. The Bf-109's engine caught fire. The pilot bailed out. The third kill came after a prolonged chase. The German pilot was skilled. He used every evasive maneuver, every trick. But Johnson stayed with him. The P-47's speed and power allowed Johnson to match every move. Finally, the German pilot made a mistake. He pulled up too steeply, lost speed, and stalled. Johnson was right behind him. He fired a burst. The Bf-109 fell away in flames. That mission gave Johnson 23 confirmed victories, making him the third highest-scoring American ace in the European theatre at that time. Only Francis Gabreski with 28 kills and Robert S. Landry with 25 had more. But Johnson's tour was ending. He had flown more than 90 combat missions. He was exhausted. The constant stress of combat had worn him down. He requested to be sent home. The request was approved. Johnson returned to the United States in July 1944. He was promoted to captain. He was assigned to training duties, teaching new P-47 pilots the tactics he had developed in combat. He spent the next year at various training bases in the United States. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Johnson was still stateside. He had not flown combat since July 1944. His final tally was 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him tied for 8th among American aces in the European theatre. But statistics do not capture what Johnson's survival on June 26, 1943, meant to the P-47 program and to American fighter pilots. Johnson's badly damaged aircraft, sitting in the hangar at Manston with more than 200 holes, became a symbol. It proved that the P-47 Thunderbolt was not just a fighter, it was a fortress. Pilots who saw the wreckage understood that if Johnson could survive that much damage, they could too. That confidence translated into aggressiveness in combat. Republic Aviation, the company that built the P-47, used Johnson's story in their advertising and internal communications. Engineers who had designed the aircraft's armor protection and redundant systems were vindicated. Their design philosophy, which prioritized pilot survival and aircraft durability over weight savings and performance, had been proven correct. The P-47's extra weight, which pilots had initially complained about, was the weight of armor and structure that kept them alive. Republic's engineers had made deliberate choices during the aircraft's design. They had specified a thick armor plate behind the pilot's seat, knowing it would add weight. They had designed redundant control cables, knowing it would add complexity. They had chosen fire-resistant hydraulic fluid, knowing it cost more. They had specified self-sealing fuel tanks, knowing it reduced fuel capacity. Every choice had been made with survivability in mind. Johnson's survival validated all of those choices. The P-47 program, which had faced criticism for producing an aircraft that was too heavy and too expensive, was now celebrated for producing an aircraft that brought pilots home alive. Production increased. By the end of 1943, Republic Aviation was building P-47 seconds at a rate of more than 400 per month. By mid-1944, production reached 600 per month. By war's end, more than 15,000 P-47 seconds had been built, making it the most produced American fighter aircraft of World War II. The P-47 served in every theatre of the war. In Europe, it flew escort missions for bombers and ground attack missions against German targets. In the Pacific, it provided close air support for American forces and attacked Japanese installations. In the China-Burma-India theatre, it flew missions against Japanese forces in Burma and China. The aircraft's durability was consistently noted in after-action reports. P-47 seconds routinely returned from missions with damage that would have destroyed other fighters. Pilots reported flying home with engines that had multiple cylinders destroyed, with control surfaces that were barely functional, with entire sections of wings or tail surfaces blown away. The safety record reflected this toughness. The P-47 had one of the lowest loss rates per sortie of any American fighter in World War II. Approximately 7 P-47 seconds were lost per 1,000 combat sorties. By comparison, the P-38 Lightning lost approximately 9 aircraft per 1,000 sorties. The P-51 Mustang lost approximately 6 per 1,000, though the Mustang flew primarily at high altitude where combat was less intense. The P-47 flew low-level ground attack missions where exposure to anti-aircraft fire was constant. Despite this, its loss rate remained acceptable. German pilots developed specific tactics for engaging P-47 seconds based on their understanding of the aircraft's strengths and weaknesses. Luftwaffe intelligence documents from late 1943 and early 1944 contained detailed analyses of the P-47's performance characteristics and recommended tactics for combat. One document, dated November 19, 1943, and distributed to Jagdgeschwader units, contained the following observations. The P-47 is heavily armoured and can absorb significant battle damage. Pilots should not assume that a P-47 that appears damaged is no longer a threat. The P-47 has excellent high-altitude performance due to its turbo-supercharger. Avoid prolonged engagements above 7,000 meters where the P-47 has superior power. The P-47 has poor maneuverability at low speeds. Force engagements below 300 km per hour where Bf-109 and W-190 fighters have advantage. The P-47 is very fast in a dive. Do not attempt to follow a P-47 inches, a vertical dive. Use horizontal maneuvers instead. The document also noted that P-47 pilots were becoming increasingly aggressive. Early in 1943, American fighter pilots had been cautious, staying close to bomber formations, avoiding risky engagements. By late 1943, American fighter pilots were pursuing German fighters aggressively, chasing them to their airfields, attacking aircraft during takeoff and landing. This change in tactics was attributed partially to the P-47 pilots' confidence in their aircraft's ability to survive combat damage. A German pilot who was captured in December 1943 and interrogated by American intelligence officers provided additional perspective. The pilot, an Oberfeldwebel with 43 confirmed victories, stated that engaging P-47 seconds had become increasingly dangerous. He explained that early in the war, German pilots could make 1 or 2 attacks on American fighters and expect to shoot them down or force them to disengage. But P-47 seconds did not disengage easily. Even when damaged, they remained dangerous. He described an incident where he had made 3 separate attacks on a single P-47, hitting it multiple times with cannon fire, only to have the P-47 turn and fire back, forcing him to break off. The interrogation report noted that this pilot's experience was consistent with reports from other captured Luftwaffe personnel. The P-47's reputation for toughness was affecting German pilot morale. Fighting an opponent who could absorb your best attacks and keep fighting was psychologically draining. Robert Johnson's post-war career was less dramatic than his combat service. He left active duty in November 1945 and returned to civilian life. He worked in various aviation-related businesses. He gave speeches about his wartime experiences. He attended reunions of the 56th Fighter Group. He wrote a memoir titled Thunderbolt, published in 1958, that described his combat missions and his survival on June 26, 1943. The book became one of the most widely read accounts of fighter combat in World War II. Johnson's description of being attacked by the Focke Wulf 190, of having his aircraft shot to pieces, of barely being able to see or control the aircraft, of making it back to England against all odds, resonated with readers. It was a story of survival through a combination of aircraft design excellence, pilot skill, and extraordinary luck. Johnson died on December 27, 1998, at the age of 78. By that time, he was recognized as one of the great fighter pilots of World War II, not just because of his 27 confirmed victories, but because his survival on June 26, 1943, had demonstrated what the P-47 Thunderbolt could endure. The P-47 Thunderbolt is often overshadowed in popular history by the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was sleek, fast, glamorous. It had a long range. It escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was the fighter that historians credit with winning the air war over Europe. The P-47 was bulky, heavy, less elegant. But pilots who flew both aircraft often preferred the P-47 for one simple reason: it brought them home alive. Francis Gabreski, who flew both P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds during his career, stated in post-war interviews that he trusted the P-47 more in combat. The P-47 could take hits that would destroy a P-51. The Mustang's liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable. One hit to the cooling system and the engine would overheat within minutes. The P-47's air-cooled radial could lose multiple cylinders and keep running. Gabreski specifically mentioned Johnson's survival as evidence of the P-47's superiority in terms of durability. Hub Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group during Johnson's combat tour, made similar statements. Zemke flew both aircraft types and noted that while the P-51 had better range and slightly better performance at certain altitudes, the P-47 was the aircraft he would choose if he knew he was going to be hit. The armor protection, the engine reliability, the structural strength, all contributed to a higher survival rate. Statistical analysis supports these observations. Data compiled after the war showed that P-47 pilots who were shot down had a higher survival rate than pilots of other fighter types. Approximately 63% of P-47 pilots who were forced to bail out or crash land survived and were either rescued or captured. The survival rate for P-51 pilots was approximately 54%. The difference was attributed to the P-47's ability to absorb damage and continue flying long enough for pilots to reach friendly territory or to bail out over areas where rescue was possible. The engineering that made the P-47 so tough was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate design decisions made by Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli was a Russian émigré who had studied engineering in France and had worked in aviation since the 1920s. He had designed several successful aircraft before the P-47, including the P-43, Lancer and the P-44 rocket. When the United States Army Air Corps issued specifications for a new fighter in 1940, Kartveli submitted a design that was unconventional. It was huge. It was heavy. It used a massive radial engine. Most other designers were proposing fighters with inline engines, sleek fuselages, minimal weight. Kartveli went the opposite direction. His philosophy was that a fighter pilot's survival depended on three things: armor to protect against hits, power to escape dangerous situations, structure to absorb damage and keep flying. Everything else was secondary. If the aircraft was heavy, that was acceptable. Weight meant strength. If the aircraft did not turn as tightly as lighter fighters, that was acceptable. Speed and power could compensate. If the aircraft was expensive to build, that was acceptable. A pilot who survived combat could fly again. A pilot who died could not. The Army Air Corps accepted Kartveli's design and awarded Republic Aviation a contract to build prototypes. The first P-47 flew on May 6, 1941. It immediately impressed test pilots with its speed and power. It could reach 400 miles per hour in level flight. It could climb to 30,000 feet. It had 850 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any American fighter at the time. Production began in 1942. Early models had issues. The turbo-supercharger system was complex and prone to failures. The engine overheating was a problem. The cockpit visibility was limited by the large engine cowling. But these issues were addressed through modifications and improved pilot training. By mid-1943, when the 56th Fighter Group began flying combat missions, the P-47 was a mature, reliable aircraft. Johnson's survival on June 26, 1943, vindicated Kartveli's design philosophy completely. The armor had saved Johnson's life. The engine had kept running despite massive damage. The structure had held together despite being hit more than 200 times. Everything Kartveli had prioritized had worked. Kartveli continued designing aircraft after the war. He designed the F-84 Thunderjet, one of the first successful American jet fighters. He designed the F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter-bomber that served in Vietnam. Both aircraft shared the P-47's design philosophy: heavy armor, powerful engines, strong structure, pilot survival prioritized over weight savings. Both aircraft earned reputations for toughness similar to the P-47. The P-47's legacy extends beyond World War II. Modern close air support aircraft, like the A-10 Thunderbolt, too borrowed design concepts directly from the P-47: heavy armor around the cockpit, redundant control systems, powerful engines. The A-10 was even named as a tribute to the P-47. The connection between the two aircraft is explicit. Both were designed to absorb damage and keep flying. Both prioritized pilot survival. Both proved in combat that durability is just as important as performance. The story of Robert Johnson and his P-47 Thunderbolt, that survived more than 200 hits, illustrates a fundamental truth about military aviation. Technology alone does not win wars. The Focke Wulf 190 that attacked Johnson was an excellent aircraft. It was fast. It was maneuverable. It had powerful armament. The pilot, likely Egon Meyer, was highly skilled and experienced. He had more than 100 confirmed victories. He knew how to kill enemy aircraft. But on June 26, 1943, all of that was not enough. Johnson survived because he flew an aircraft that had been designed from the beginning to bring pilots home alive. Every decision Republic Aviation's engineers made, every extra pound of armor, every redundant system, every structural reinforcement, contributed to that survival. When Meyer fired his guns and saw his rounds hitting Johnson's aircraft, he expected to see it fall apart. That is what normally happened when you hit an enemy fighter with sustained cannon fire. But the P-47 did not fall apart. It absorbed the damage. It kept flying. And Johnson escaped. The psychological impact of that survival extended far beyond one mission. Other P-47 pilots heard the story. They saw the photographs of Johnson's damaged aircraft. They understood that they too could survive catastrophic damage if they flew the Thunderbolt. That confidence made them better fighter pilots. They fought more aggressively. They pressed attacks. They took risks they would not have taken in more fragile aircraft. German pilots learned the opposite lesson. They learned that P-47 seconds were hard to kill. That knowledge made them more cautious. Some avoided P-47 seconds when possible. Others would make one attack and disengage rather than pursuing a damaged Thunderbolt. That hesitation gave American pilots additional advantages. In warfare, perception matters as much as reality. The reality was that P-47 seconds could be destroyed. They were shot down throughout the war. But the perception, reinforced by incidents like Johnson's survival, was that P-47 seconds were nearly indestructible. That perception affected how both sides fought. By the end of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more than 746,000 combat sorties. It had destroyed 11,000 enemy aircraft, 4,000 in aerial combat, and 7,000 on the ground. It had dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. It had fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and it had brought home thousands of pilots who otherwise would have died. Robert Johnson's survival was just one example, but it was the example that proved what the P-47 could do. When Luftwaffe pilots were terrified that one P-47 survived more than 200 hits and still flew home, they were acknowledging that they faced an opponent they could not easily defeat. Not because American pilots were better, though many were skilled. Not because American tactics were superior, though they were effective. But because American engineers had built an aircraft that valued pilot survival above all else. That engineering philosophy, embodied in the P-47 Thunderbolt, changed the outcome of the air war over Europe. German pilots could shoot P-47 seconds. They could hit them repeatedly with cannon fire. They could see the strikes, see the damage, see the smoke. But too often, the P-47 kept flying. Too often, the American pilot escaped. Too often, the German pilot ran out of ammunition before the American aircraft fell from the sky. That frustration, repeated across thousands of engagements over 3 years of combat, wore down the Luftwaffe's fighter force. By 1944, experienced German pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Inexperienced pilots thrown into combat against P-47 seconds and other American fighters did not last long. The P-47's durability gave American pilots time to gain experience. A pilot who survived his first 10 missions by bringing home a badly damaged P-47 would live to fly 20 more missions, 30 more, 50 more. Each additional mission made him more skilled, more dangerous, more likely to survive the next engagement. German pilots did not have that luxury. Their aircraft were less forgiving. A hit to the cooling system in a Bf-109 meant the engine would fail. A hit to the fuel tank in a W-190 often meant fire. German pilots who took serious damage usually died or were forced to bail out. That difference in survivability created a cumulative advantage for American forces. By late 1944, the average experience level of American fighter pilots in Europe was significantly higher than that of their German opponents. The Luftwaffe still had some highly skilled aces, but most of their pilots were young, inexperienced, and poorly trained. They faced American veterans flying aircraft that could absorb damage and keep fighting. The outcome was predictable. American pilots achieved kill ratios of 5-1, 10-1, sometimes higher. The P-47 was a major contributor to that success, not the only contributor. Tactics mattered, training mattered, numbers mattered, but durability mattered too. And the P-47 Thunderbolt was the most durable fighter aircraft of World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.